I travel a lot for work, mostly around the Midwest, and after years of staying in cheap hotels you start noticing patterns. The smell of old carpet in the hallways, the buzzing vending machines near the elevators, the fake paintings hanging above beds that all somehow look exactly the same. Most nights blend together. But there's one stay from about 3 years ago that still bothers me because even now I can't fully explain what the man in the room next to mine was actually doing. At the time, I was driving through southern Illinois for a construction supply company I worked for, checking inventory between warehouses. It was late November, cold enough that my windshield kept fogging over every 20 minutes. Around 11 p.m. I realized I was too exhausted to keep driving, so I pulled off the highway near a small town called Benton and checked into this old 2-story motel sitting behind a gas station. It wasn't one of those chain hotels either. It looked like something from the early 80s that had barely been updated. The sign outside had missing letters, and half the parking lot lights were burned out. But I didn't care. I just needed sleep. The woman at the front desk looked tired and distracted. She barely spoke while checking me in. I remember hearing a small TV behind her playing some crime show quietly while she slid my keycard across the counter. She gave me room 214 on the second floor. The motel had outdoor walkways instead of indoor hallways, so when I parked near the stairs I noticed how quiet everything was. There were maybe 4 or 5 cars total in the entire lot. Most of the rooms looked dark. My room itself was exactly what you'd expect. Old heater rattling under the window, stiff blankets, one lamp flickering every few seconds. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and took a shower. By midnight I was laying in bed watching random local channels trying to fall asleep. That's when I first heard the noise next door. At first it sounded like furniture scraping across the floor. Just a quick dragging sound, then silence. I ignored it. Hotels are noisy. A few minutes later I heard it again. This time slower. Like someone pulling something heavy across the carpet. Then came a loud thump against the wall separating our rooms. I remember glancing toward the wall for a second because it startled me. Then everything went quiet again. About 10 minutes later, I heard the room door next to mine open. Footsteps crossed the walkway outside, then faded toward the stairs. I figured the guy had left, which honestly relieved me because I was exhausted. But maybe 20 minutes later I woke up to another noise. 3 hard knocks against my wall. Not the door. The wall. I opened my eyes immediately and looked at the clock beside the bed. 1:17 a.m. Then I heard the dragging sound again. Slow. Heavy. Back and forth. I sat there listening for probably a minute straight. The weirdest part was there were no other sounds mixed in with it. No TV. No voices. No footsteps. Just dragging. Then another thump. At that point I got annoyed enough to call the front desk. Nobody answered. I tried twice before giving up. Eventually the noise stopped again, and I drifted back asleep. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up the second time, but this time something felt off immediately. The room was completely silent except for the heater clicking softly under the window. Then I realized why I'd woken up. Someone was standing outside my room. I could see a shadow through the thin gap under the door. Just motionless feet blocking the light from outside. I froze there staring at it. The shadow didn't move for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard breathing. Very faint, but definitely there. Slow breathing right outside my door. I sat up slowly without making noise. My first thought was maybe someone had the wrong room, maybe they were drunk or confused. But then the doorknob moved slightly. Just once. Like someone testing whether it was locked. Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and stayed completely still. The shadow remained there another few seconds before finally moving away. I heard slow footsteps walking toward the neighboring room. Then silence again. I barely slept after that. Around 4 a.m. I eventually got up to use the bathroom, and that's when I noticed something else. My curtain near the parking lot window was cracked open slightly. I knew for a fact I'd closed it before bed because the parking lot light outside was shining directly into the room earlier. I walked over and looked outside carefully. At first I didn't see anyone. Then near the ice machine across the lot, I spotted a man standing perfectly still in the dark. He was facing directly toward my room. Even from that distance I could tell he was wearing some dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. I remember staring at him for maybe 5 seconds trying to process whether he was even looking at me. Then he slowly started walking back toward the motel rooms. Not quickly. Just casually. But he disappeared beneath the walkway overhang before I could see where he went. I locked the deadbolt again even though it was already locked. Then I shoved the small table in front of the door like an idiot because suddenly I felt genuinely nervous. Around sunrise I must have finally passed out because the next thing I knew my alarm was going off at 7:30. I packed fast, wanting to leave as soon as possible. While carrying my bag to the car, I glanced toward the room next to mine. Room 216. The door was slightly open. At first I thought housekeeping had arrived early, but then I noticed something strange. The room looked almost completely empty inside. No luggage. No clothes. No TV on. Just a mattress and a chair near the wall. Then I noticed dark stains on the carpet beside the bed. And before I could look closer, I heard the room door creak open wider behind me. I turned instinctively toward the sound, expecting maybe housekeeping or another guest, but instead I saw a man standing halfway behind the door of room 216 staring directly at me. He looked older than I expected, probably late 50s, thin with pale skin and deep lines around his mouth. What stood out most were his eyes. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. For a second neither of us said anything. The cold morning air carried that stale motel smell mixed with cigarette smoke from somewhere nearby. I remember tightening my grip on my bag without even realizing it. The guy slowly opened the door wider and stepped halfway into the walkway. He wore jeans and a gray hoodie, the same dark clothing I'd seen near the ice machine earlier. Up close, he looked sweaty despite the freezing temperature outside. Then he gave me this awkward smile that didn't feel natural at all. "Morning," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough, like he'd been yelling or smoking all night. I nodded quickly and started moving toward the stairs because honestly the whole situation felt wrong. But before I got far, he spoke again. "You hear anything last night?" I stopped automatically. The question caught me off guard. I turned slightly and shrugged. "Just some noise," I said. "Furniture moving or something." He stared at me for a second too long before nodding slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "Sorry about that. I should have just left right there, but something about the room behind him kept bothering me. From where I stood, I could see more clearly inside now. The room really did look mostly empty. The mattress had no sheets on it, just the bare stained surface exposed. There were no bags anywhere. No personal items. Nothing except that wooden chair sitting near the far wall facing the bed. It honestly looked less like a motel room and more like a room being cleaned out after someone moved away suddenly. Then I noticed the smell. Even standing outside, I caught this weird metallic odor drifting from inside the room. Not strong, but noticeable enough that it immediately made me uncomfortable. The man must have noticed me looking because he shifted slightly to block the doorway. "Maintenance issue," he said quickly, almost rehearsed. "They're fixing plumbing." I nodded again even though the explanation made no sense. Then I headed downstairs to my car. As I loaded my bag into the trunk, I kept glancing toward the second-floor walkway without meaning to. The guy remained standing outside room 216 watching me. He didn't smoke or move around. He just stood there with his hands in his hoodie pockets staring down toward the parking lot. The moment I got into my car, he stepped back into the room and shut the door. I left immediately after that. I stopped at a gas station maybe 10 minutes down the highway to grab coffee before continuing the drive. While standing in line, I realized I still felt strangely unsettled. I think part of me wanted reassurance that I was just being paranoid from lack of sleep. So I casually mentioned the motel to the cashier, an older woman probably in her 60s. The second I mentioned the motel's name, her expression changed slightly. "That old place?" she asked. "You stayed there?" I nodded. She shook her head slowly while pouring coffee for another customer. "People complain about that place all the time." "About what?" I asked. She shrugged. "Weird stuff. Noise mostly. Cops show up there pretty often." I remember forcing a laugh and saying something like, "Yeah, the guy next door was acting strange." The woman looked up immediately. "What room?" she asked. 216, I said. Her face tightened just slightly before she looked away again. "Huh," she muttered quietly. "Figures." Before I could ask anything else, another customer interrupted the conversation and I ended up leaving. But the whole interaction stuck with me during the drive. I kept replaying the sounds from the night before in my head. The dragging. The knocking. The breathing outside my door. By the time I got home that evening, I'd mostly convinced myself I was overthinking everything. Then 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown Illinois number while at work. I almost ignored it, but answered at the last second. The man on the line introduced himself as a detective with the Benton Police Department. The second he mentioned the motel, my stomach dropped. He asked if I had stayed in room 214 on the night of November 18th. I said yes. Then he asked whether I'd heard or seen anything unusual during the night. I remember stepping outside the warehouse while talking because suddenly my chest felt tight. I told him about the noises, the man outside my room, everything I could remember. The detective stayed quiet most of the time, occasionally asking specific questions about times or sounds. Then I asked the obvious question. "What happened?" There was a pause before he answered. "The occupant of room 216 is missing," he said. "Hotel staff reported blood inside the room." I felt cold immediately hearing that. I asked if the man I spoke to that morning was the missing guest. "No," the detective replied. "That's why we're calling you." According to him, the room had been rented to a traveling salesman from Missouri who hadn't been seen since that night. The motel owner claimed nobody else was supposed to have access to the room. But housekeeping discovered blood on the carpet and mattress later that afternoon after I checked out. The man I'd spoken to outside the room didn't match the missing guest's description at all. I remember gripping my phone tighter while the detective continued talking. Then he said something that genuinely disturbed me. One of the neighboring guests had reported hearing furniture being dragged repeatedly throughout the night. Another reported someone knocking on random doors around 3 a.m. The detective asked if I could describe the man again, so I did the best I could. Thin build. Gray hoodie. Pale face. Tired eyes. When I finished, the detective went quiet for several seconds. Finally he said, "That sounds similar to someone another witness described." "Who was he?" I asked. The detective hesitated. "We don't know." After the call ended, I sat in my truck outside work for almost 20 minutes just staring ahead. The entire situation suddenly felt far more real than it had before. That night I barely slept, thinking about how close that guy had been standing outside my room while I slept. Thinking about the doorknob moving. Thinking about the strange empty room beside mine. But the part that still bothers me most happened about a month later. I received another call from the same detective. He told me they still hadn't found the missing man. No body. No suspect. Nothing. Then, right before ending the call, he mentioned one final detail they hadn't released publicly. The blood found inside room 216 belonged to more than one person. And one of those samples didn't match anyone in their system. About 6 months after that phone call, I tried hard to stop thinking about the motel entirely. Work got busy again, I moved apartments, and eventually the whole thing started feeling distant, like one of those strange memories you convince yourself wasn't as serious as it felt at the time. But late one night the following summer, something happened that brought everything back immediately. I was sitting in my apartment around midnight watching YouTube when my phone buzzed with a blocked number. Normally I ignore unknown calls that late, but for some reason I answered. At first I only heard static. Then breathing. Not loud breathing either. Just slow, steady breaths against the receiver. My stomach tightened instantly because it sounded exactly like the breathing I'd heard outside the motel room door that night. "Hello?" I said. No response. Just static and breathing. Then the line disconnected. I remember sitting there staring at my phone for several seconds before checking the call log again. Blocked number. No voicemail. I convinced myself it was probably spam, or some drunk dialing random numbers. But then 2 nights later it happened again. Same blocked number. Same silence. Same breathing. This time I hung up immediately. A few minutes later my phone buzzed again with a voicemail notification, even though it hadn't rung a second time. I played it back while standing in my kitchen. At first there was nothing except static. Then somewhere faintly in the background I heard what sounded like scraping. Slow dragging noises across a hard surface. My chest went tight hearing it because I recognized the sound instantly. It was the exact same noise from the motel room wall. I replayed the voicemail 3 times, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then near the very end of the message, right before it cut off, I heard a voice whisper something too distorted to fully understand. But it sounded close to. "He saw me." I barely slept that night. The next morning I called the detective from Benton using the numbers saved in my phone history. A receptionist answered and informed me the detective had transferred departments months earlier. When I explained why I was calling, she sounded confused at first before putting me on hold. Eventually another officer came on the line. I explained the calls and voicemail, feeling ridiculous while saying it out loud. The officer asked me to email the recording, which I did immediately. Later that afternoon he called back and said the audio was too unclear to identify anything useful. Then he casually mentioned something that made my skin crawl. "You're not the first person from that motel to report strange calls," he said. I asked what he meant. He explained another guest who'd stayed there around the same time had contacted police after receiving late-night calls from blocked numbers for weeks. According to the officer, the guest eventually changed his number, and the calls stopped. "Did they ever figure out who was making them?" I asked. "No," he answered. "Could be prank stuff. Hard to trace blocked calls." But his tone didn't sound convincing. After hanging up, I sat at work unable to focus the rest of the day. The voicemail kept replaying in my head over and over. That night before bed, I checked my apartment locks twice. Then 3 times. Around 2 a.m. I woke suddenly to a noise outside my apartment door. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again clearly. A soft dragging sound in the hallway. Slow. Deliberate. My body immediately went rigid in bed. I lived on the third floor of a small apartment building with thin walls and narrow hallways. Usually you could hear neighbors talking or TVs playing faintly at night. But at that moment everything outside sounded dead silent except for that scraping noise. Then it stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath listening. A few seconds later came 3 slow knocks against the wood. Not loud. Just enough to make my pulse spike instantly. I didn't move. The knocks came again. 3 more. My phone sat charging beside the bed, but I was too frozen to even reach for it. Then I heard breathing outside the door. Faint. Steady. Exactly like before. I stayed completely still for what felt like forever. Eventually the breathing stopped. Then came slow footsteps retreating down the hallway, followed by silence. I finally grabbed my phone and looked through the peephole near the door, but the hallway was empty. The motion sensor lights near the stairwell were off, meaning nobody had walked through there recently. I barely slept after that. The next morning I checked with my downstairs neighbor, an older guy named Rick who smoked constantly outside the building. I casually asked if he'd heard anyone in the hallway overnight. He looked at me strangely before saying, "Actually, yeah?" My stomach dropped. He told me he'd been awake around 2 a.m. watching TV when he heard someone walking slowly through the hallway upstairs. He assumed it was another tenant until he heard knocking that continued for several minutes. "Sounded weird," he said. "Like they were knocking on random doors." The second he said that, I felt cold all over. I didn't tell him why I was asking. Instead, I went back upstairs and listened to the voicemail again. This time I noticed another sound buried under the static. A television. Very faint, but definitely there. Some old movie or commercial playing in the background. It hit me almost immediately where I'd heard that exact muffled TV sound before. The motel front desk. The woman checking me in had been watching television behind the counter all night. Suddenly I remembered something else too. The front desk clerk never answered when I called during the noises that first night. Not once. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of me and I searched online for the motel again. What I found made my stomach sink. The motel had shut down permanently 2 months earlier after a fire damaged several rooms on the second floor. Room 214 and 216 were specifically listed among the damaged units. But the weirdest part was buried in a local news article mentioning the incident. According to investigators, security footage from the motel parking lot captured a hooded man entering room 216 alone on the night the salesman disappeared. Hours later, the same man was seen leaving the room carrying something large wrapped in blankets toward the back of the property. The footage quality was poor, and police never publicly identified him. But what bothered me most was the timestamp. The footage showed him leaving at 3:11 a.m. The exact time I'd woken up and seen someone standing outside my motel room door.